with great power comes great responsibility. You are in a position of housing all of my, Jim, you and our identities. You better protect them. Privacy, fraud, scams. I want you to take care of it. And if you can't, I'm like, what? Decentralized identity is not going to solve that. That's just kicking the can down the road to someone else. If we don't solve the transition from IAM to identity security, decentralized identity it's not going to help anybody, because I'm going to be like, well, I got a verifiable claim, but can I actually trust it? Well, it was digitally signed by somebody. I'm like, yeah, well, what if someone manipulated that IAM backend system of that identity provider and generated that verifiable claim?
This is Identity at the Center. If it has anything to do with IAM, this is the go-to podcast. Now your hosts, Jim McDonald and Jeff Stedman.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jim McDonald. Today, I'm not joined by Jeff Stedman. Unfortunately, he was unable to make our recording session today. But fortunately, I am joined by our guest, David Mahdi. He's the CIO over at Transmit Security. He's a past Gartner analyst and a current model for Men's Health magazine. I made up that last part, David. What do you think?
I think that's hilarious. You're too kind. But Jim, as always, we miss Jeff. Jeff, shout out. I hope to see you soon, I think at the Gartner Summit. But Jim, absolutely a pleasure to be here. And thank you so much for having me on again.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. And, if you, for folks who are listening, if you haven't registered for the Gartner Summit yet, we do have a discount code. It helps us if you use it, because it lets the Gartner people know that you're listening to the podcast and, this is one of your main sources for industry information. Anyway, that code is IDAC 375. There's not a better code out there. I think you save 375 with other codes, including Gartner's code, but go ahead and use ours anyway. So having said that, we'll also have a link to the registration in the show notes. Wanted to kind of introduce David. Normally what we do is say, how did you get into IAM? But David's been on the podcast a few times already. He covered that aspect in episode 209, which was last April. He also was with us in episode 239 this past October. And what I thought was cool, David, was I was looking back through the notes and what we talked about. And in 209, you talked about this fusion that's happening within the industry between cybersecurity and identity. And it's like, man, like major trend, that has been, I think it's like almost dominant in what we're doing today and what we're talking about. The second episode, you focused on non-human identities, or I think you were calling it the rise of the machines, kind of a wink toward the Terminator movie series. Also very prescient, or what is the word for that? But you kind of saw that one coming, and now it's like it's on the tip of everyone's tongue. We're going to talk about a couple of topics today, including identity security and cyber resilience. But what I wanted to ask you about is, what have you been up to for the past year? And, I know you've been living in a tube flying all over the world. I guess that's a big part of what you've been doing.
Yeah, 100%. No, I mean, hey, Jim, there's a lot to unpack there. Definitely no dull moment in our space for sure. And there's a lot we can do. But I think, yeah, a good point probably to start on is identity security, because whether it's a human or a machine, it's the whole framework that it's not an option. Every organization in the world that has any digital footprint will need to have the people, process, and technology that wraps around identity security. And
what is
identity
security?
That is a great question, Jim. That's exactly what I was going to. No, so it's look, there's IAM and then there's identity security, and they're related, but they're different. And so, it's great that we're seeing the term identity security more and more and more, but I think it is a badge that you need to earn. And it's something that is not easy to do. That's both for vendors and practitioners. Now, just, I know I did an introduction in previous episodes, but this one is very near and dear to my heart. So my own personal evolution as I sit here today, actually, in my view, it maps well to the evolution of where I see identity security. Really quickly, I got started, when I was a kid in the space. I was very fortunate to have access to really good computer hardware. And, I jumped on pretty early, and I really just learned how to, mess around with like config.sys and autoexecute.bat and got into all that stuff because I, learned about memory management only because I wanted my games to work, I didn't have enough extended memory and all this stuff for certain games, and I went in and played with all that. Anyway, long story short, I ended up doing bad things because I wanted to get games, and I got into doing BBS and then IRC, and then I had folks we traded 0 to 3 day wares, and then they taught me, just different hacking patterns, or what you call TTPs, tactics, tools, and procedures, and learned that a long time ago and got into some trouble, but it was okay. And so that was in I'm dating myself here, but that was in the 90s, the early 90s and mid 90s. And I always knew back then when I was fiddling around and breaking things that identity was, we didn't really call it back then, but I always knew those systems were just to be honest, a joke. You could kind of get in and just get into a system or get into the app, and then everything would just be stored in clear text. And there's all kinds of things that you can do. And, and so that was a long time ago. Fast forward to where we are now. I entered the market as a professional, and I started off in endpoint security. So not even identity at all. Looking at malware, looking at all these things, keyloggers, spyware, all that kind of stuff. And then I had a stint there. It was about 6-7 years. Then flipped over to identity, and I've been in identity ever since. And so it's been 20 years almost. Anyway, why am I telling you all this? Because when I started working in the identity space, I always thought, this is insane that these tools don't really take into account the activity and behavior that's going on the systems, the endpoints. And vice versa with the antivirus stacks, or the endpoint security stacks, as we would call them, or even platforms. They were completely blind to identity. I'm like, why can't you push to ask someone to authenticate if something looks weird? I don't understand. And why don't the applications have identity themselves, or AKA machine identity? So that kind of all came together when I was at Gartner. And it was probably around 2016-ish, because my role at Gartner, yes, I was on the identity team, but they put me in a position where I was covering data security, some cybersecurity stuff and risk, and then identity, right? And so they purposely put me in that position to be, a convergence kind of analyst to looking at all this stuff. And so anyway, mapping back to identity security, I see it as an evolution. I see identity and access management. This was all these tools and solutions, again, because I was a Gartner analyst, and Jim, you know this because you roll up your sleeves, deploy this stuff, and it's all built for productivity, right? I'll just state the definition. I'll read out the definition that Gartner has for IAM, Jim, and I want you to chime in here because I've been blabbing too much here. But Gartner's definition for IAM is IAM ensures the right people get the right access to the right resources at the right times for the right reasons, enabling the right business outcome. Now, they say people. I think they've updated it to say also machines. So machines can do it too. But when you look at that, Jim, that just said that to me, the focus there is joiner, mover, leaver. It's all about productivity, right? Jim joins Gartner, maybe as an analyst, and let's give him, he's a joiner, right? And then we want to give him access to all the stuff, all the systems and resources that an analyst should have access to so he can do his job, so he can be productive. If he can't get access to, let's say, the inquiry data so he could track trends, he can't do his job properly. No one wants to get in the way of that. Anyways, go ahead.
Well, no, I think to kick it over to me, I've long been making the case that definition is dated, and that definition is going to, it's going to just be obsolete. Maybe it already is. I mean, you can tack on the right device and the right time and the right applications and as many of those things.
And then it becomes 3 pages long. But yeah.
But until you get to the point where you say, that the right person has the right access to whatever data or applications or whatever, and they're doing the right things with them, right? And which implies that you are tracking, that you have visibility to how those accounts are being used, which there's your identity security. And I'm not, picking on Gartner by saying that. This is just, to me, it's like, there's the administration of the accounts.
Yes.
There's even setting up the guards for what is required for a strong authentication, things like that. Maybe it's continuous authentication, it's the building of all those areas. But then this real next frontier is the identity security component, which is, and now we're looking at how those identities are being used. We're spotting patterns. We're using machine learning to say this is normal behavior, this is abnormal behavior. And a lot of times people say, oh, yeah, that's what we had with UEBA. And it's like, okay, yeah, but whatever happened to that? Because I remember when that space was first identified, it was like, okay, yeah, this is going to do something. And, it kind of just fell off the charts. And then ITSM comes along.
Yes.
And to me, it's like, that's the next great hope, is that there's something that's pulling in how these identities and access are actually being used. Forget what they're supposed to have access to. Like if somebody's trying to access resources that they're not supposed to be able to, is that normal behavior? Have they ever tried to access stuff they weren't supposed to? Now they're scanning the network for what can they do? Can you now respond to that? Can you now take action on it? So to me, that's what the identity security piece is. And it's fundamental to what identity and access management has to become. And it's going back to kind of that key topic that you brought on last April. It's the merging of security, SIM, logging, etc.
Yeah.
And identity, but probably the area that makes it most exciting is layering the machine learning or, AI, maybe not generative AI, maybe it's just simply machine learning, but it's the cognition of, okay, this is normal, this is abnormal, and therefore I should take this action.
Exactly. And I think so I think you're spot on, Jim. It's the definition. I think Gartner is, evolving it, right? And my view is like it needs to go from joiner, mover, leaver, and adversary just to kind of capture that framework. And the attacks happen, right? You look at Verizon data breach report, IBM, like pick any research report. The number one form of attack is still on identity. We know that. And I even found some rough notes. I had handwritten notes. I was cleaning up my desk because I saved all this stuff. My wife always gets mad at me because I'm not a hoarder, but I probably should throw out more stuff than I have. Like I still have lots of badges and stuff from events from like years ago. But anyway, I found some handwritten notes, like, because usually I'm brainstorming and I'd be like, all right, I'm going to write a research note on something and I'll brainstorm like the key findings.
That's what's great about pen and paper.
I use a Remarkable. I'm not sponsored by Remarkable. I have it in front of me. It's an e-ink. I like it because it's connected, so it backs up, but I can't browse the internet with it. And I kind of like it because it allows me to focus. And I use it as a way, I can sit out in the sunshine and it doesn't look weird like my iPad. Yeah. And it just allows me to do that. There's just something, I don't know, because I don't know the research, but there's definitely something connected with like the brain and creativity and all that in your fingers and your hands, right? But anyway, I found a research note, and the first key finding I just scribbled down was, and this was 2017, Jim. Okay. Identity and credential-based attacks remain number one. Okay. So, and we look at ransomware. One of the last research notes I wrote at Gartner was ransomware is not a malware problem. And I did that as, to get people's attention. And I'm like, it's an identity and data access problem. Right. So anyway, the narrative, when you asked me about traveling around the world, I just came back recently from Singapore. And before that, I was at the FIDO Authenticate conference. And shout out to the FIDO team. You guys did an amazing job. Same with Identity Week as well in Singapore. So I did part of the keynote, and the topic was identity crisis, why our IAM systems are failing us, and how Gen AI is going to accelerate their obsolescence. When we go back to that Gartner definition, right? And we look at identity, and it's like, look, all of the main IAM platforms that have been out there, and I know them well and I know you know them well in your role, and we've had a lot of history with them, but also as a Gartner analyst, I had a very good insight into them because I would talk to the customers, I'd talk to investors, and I would talk to the vendors themselves, and they'd bring me on site, I'd see their roadmaps, I'd hear how they're thinking, and I'd get to see how as they say, how the sausage is made. And it's like, they're all stuck in the innovator's dilemma. A lot of them were anyway. Just doing everything that the customers are asking, everything, Jim, you said with like governance, accounts, looking like we can't stop doing that. We have to continue doing that, right? We're not abandoning what we've done with IAM. But there's a reason why these breaches keep happening, because attackers know that if one, they can compromise an identity, they can use it. Two, if they can also get to the IAM system, they can manipulate it and change access, and they pretty much have keys to your kingdom. So I don't know. I just get very frustrated when people say like, oh, single sign-on, it's security. I'm like, nah, it's not really. It's more of a productivity thing. MFA is good. We should be doing it as a minimum, but like also remember there's MFA fatigue, and attackers know about that. That's why they go after telcos. Because if they go after telcos, they can do a SIM swap, and now they can get the code sent to you, right? And there's lots of examples I can unpack. So honestly, again, going back to my evolution as a professional, and then I map that to the evolution of identity, and I'm like, it's the IAM providers. They are in the driver's seat. They have the money. They've got the positions in organizations, like physically, to actually add this stuff on. And I think it's actually been, sure, the security platforms, but they weren't plugged into these identity systems deeply to see that behavior that you were mentioning. And so this is what we're seeing now, is that finally, after I told a lot of these vendors years ago, like, you need to start thinking about this, now they're starting to see it. And again, it's because you have the MGM breach, you have Okta that was breached several times, and CISOs now are like, yeah, identity is it's at the center, right? The name of this podcast. So I'll stop there, but that's effectively, Jim, what I've been presenting. And I think I'm not going to bore you with identity attacks and their stats, because I could go on and on and on. I think we need to stop and say, why is this happening? And I think it's not just the technology, but it's the IAM people, practice, and technology. And we have to recognize all this technology was built for productivity. And especially if you're thinking about customer facing stuff, this technology was built for workforce employees. These directory systems are like 30 years old. I'm not using a 30-year-old mobile device. I'm not even using a 30-year-old car. So, but anyway, I don't know, Jim, what your thoughts are on that, but that's definitely what I've been seeing and the complaints I've been getting from a lot of leaders in the industry.
I mean, I think that is the beauty of moving to a software as a service model, is like you should get on a system that continues to make advancements, keep up with the industry. If you pick the right vendor, they're going to be heavily investing in the product and making it better, and you get to take advantage of that. It also gets me thinking about kind of the big picture of why I think it's so hard to realize the transition from ensuring that the right people have the right access, transitioning to, and that they're using it as expected, because that implies that you have visibility and logging and the machine intelligence layer, which is hard enough to do in kind of a cloud provider, but it's manageable, right? Because they keep a central log of everything happening in their environment. And that's why you're able to have KIM solutions. And I'll argue with you and Henrique and Paul, who've all told me it's pronounced Kim, because to me it's Keem.
I know, it's weird. You know what? There's no argument with me. That's just one of them, to be honest, Jim. I don't even want to get in that. I don't even want to get in that argument. Whatever you want to call it. I just actually just say CIEM, and that way there's no like confusion.
Right. Cloud infrastructure and total management made possible by the fact that your cloud provider sets up a, whatever they call it, a tenant for you.
Yep.
And they have an IAM system, and they log all the activities centrally and can map the access you have versus the access you're using, and constantly enable you to cull, entitlements or roles, things that, access that people have that they don't need, which is what creates the expanded, attack surface. To me, that's very hard to do in the enterprise, and it's why that the KIM functionality is kind of limited to just clouds. You can't get KIM for the enterprise, can you?
No. Well, I mean, I think the challenge there's a few things. Number one, the KIM solution is only able to access push and pull, right? So pull, meaning it can get those logs, get the data. Push, meaning it can execute commands and do things. And they're at the subject of whatever the cloud provider allows, right? So whatever say APIs they give you access to, you can do those, right? Programmatically and have automation and all this stuff. Or, those cloud providers could keep it for themselves and say, no, you got to use our own mechanisms in order to access those. So that's the challenge. And then you're right, on-prem, it's a mishmash of, maybe SIM and other discovery tools and other things like that. I actually had a call recently about post-quantum cryptography, and they were just asked, and I don't want to like conflate everything here and go off the rails, but like, because I also used to cover that when I was at Gartner, and I had some folks asking me, where do you start with that? How do we get ready? Right. And it's like discovery tools and all this. Oh, and keep in mind how you do discovery and management with these cloud environments. Jim, going back to KIM or CIEM, is going to come back to that. But I mean, I think the biggest thing in our industry right now, in my view, but I don't really care because it's anchored in facts, is a lot of these breaches, which are obviously pretty important, they're tied to identity. And I go, okay, who are the leaders of the industry? We know who the leaders are. Solve that problem, please. And if you're not solving it, I mean, that's why we see it's great. We see a rich landscape of ITDR vendors and all this stuff popping up. And I think we're still going to continue to see that. But it's not just, and I don't want to make this purely about the technology. It's also the organizations themselves. If your identity team is different than your information and your cybersecurity teams, that you got a problem there. You need to start bringing them together. You need to start thinking about red teaming and doing tabletop exercises for your identity team. Even though they might be only focused on productivity, they need to be aware of these different types of attacks that all focus on identity. And don't even get me started with deepfakes, because that just changes everything, right? So I think all of these, the reliance on the productivity-centric based stuff has caused a lot of issues. And then there's another point to all this, Jim, which when we unpack identity security, it means all of the things we did with IAM, but an IAM system and the teams that are threat aware, fraud aware, and they're able to actually say like, oh, wait, this isn't Jim. His behavior, that's not him, right? Like maybe we should stop it. And then, oh, Jim was traveling in, Jamaica this week. And okay, it looked weird, but it's him. Maybe we'll give him disabled access because he's not in a place we, would prefer to whatever reason. But we'll give him access, right? So it's answering the question, like, who is the user? Who is this thing? Is it the right thing? Is it the wrong thing? And all that stuff. And I think that identity is the place where you start, but the threat awareness, the security side has to be.
I think some of these tools have to just on the Jamaica thing, they have to run in learning mode for some period of time before you start taking kind of archaic action. Yep. I was kind of thinking about the point that you made a little bit earlier, which was around, these leading security vendors like fix the problem. Is it their problem to fix, or is it the CISOs problem to fix. In other words, piece together the solutions that you need to secure your enterprise. Because you can say, all right, my access management vendor protects me up to the point of coming in the door. But then, you might do a great job at that, but maybe somebody's already been through the door, or, 1 in a million gets through. And then they get into your system and live off the land for what's the average as somebody gets in until it's detected?
3. Yeah. So actually, that's a great question. So IBM in their recent data breach report, it was like the average time to detection of an identity related breach is like 300 days, or like close to 300 days on average. Let's just say it's 300, right? How much damage, Jim, do you think you can do in 300 days if you had an employee's account or a customer account, right?
You only have to do the ultimate damage. It's like you could have armies spread out all over the world.
Yeah.
All you have to do is detonate one nuclear weapon.
Exactly. And,
Right?
and let's be honest. Oh no, go ahead. Sorry. Keep going.
That's your like super domain admin of your Active Directory for many organizations. Like if you're somehow able to get your hands on that account, living off the land, trying to get access to non-human identities, which by the way, in 99% of organizations, 9% of use cases are not using MFA.
No.
A lot of times the most powerful accounts, the organization doesn't even know all that they do. They're afraid to shut it off or afraid to take away that super admin capability. Or maybe you're running some kind of, third-party software and it requires access to your network and you're looking at the next SolarWinds kind of scenario.
Yeah.
I mean, those are the nightmares, right?
You said there was a lot of very important things that you just said in like the last 20 seconds, honestly.
That's what I do. I throw 20 ideas into one statement and I say, you ever see the SNL skit, the old one, Give Me More Cowbell? And I want you to explore the space, man. So I threw a bunch of ideas out there. Take it, David. Run with it. Explore the space.
All right. I'm going to use my
But I got to have more cowbell, baby.
I'm using my remarkable to, just track some of these things. But, okay. So number one, let me first just go to the first point you posed. And you're like, well, who's responsible for all this stuff, right? And it's like, okay, let's set that aside for a second and just talk about outcomes. Okay. If you and I, Jim, we were like, you're head of risk and I'm the CISO for a very large bank. Okay. And we just keep getting these identity breaches. And let's just say, we know that we're using a market leader for IAM and for a customer facing environment. And maybe we're using the same platform because we thought that might make sense from a financial perspective. Our CFO liked it. And, then we've got, we know we have all these like best of breed cybersecurity tools and platforms and cloud security and this, that, and the other, right? We were like, okay, well, hold on. Why did we just have this identity breach? And whose fault is it, right? Well, look, number one, you mentioned productivity, right? At the end of the day, you said scared to turn it on. That is, remember, like the definition of IAM is right people, right access, right resources. But the reason why so many accounts have so much access to stuff they shouldn't have is because no one wanted to get in the way. And frankly, people downplayed all the attacks. I know because when I was a lot younger than I am now, and my first security job, there was a CIO that will go unnamed. Maybe if they're still around, I don't know, because it was a long time ago. But they were like just about to retire, and I remember showing them all these vulnerabilities. I'm like, I can easily do this. I can easily like get access to this. And then he said to me, this was like 20 years ago, Jim, son, no one would ever do that. Why would someone come into our environment and take our data? It just doesn't make any sense. Okay, and this was I can't say who it is, but in the sector it was kind of like finance a little bit, good size organization too, and I still kept that to this day. That's still in the back of my mind, but I don't think any CISO, if I go back to you and me being the CRO and the CISO, we wouldn't say that. We'd be like, well, we have no idea if people are already in our network. We just have to always assume breach and always look at, what people are doing. But whose fault is it? What do we do? Well, look, we know we have this IAM system, but we know now that it should, like we're hearing from Gartner about ITDR, we're hearing from others about identity breaches takes 300 days. Like that's pretty scary. So our job is to mitigate the risk. And if we look at some of these platforms, we're not necessarily going to like rip them out because they're very sticky and they're managing all of our identities, but they are in the position, right, of building out more threat aware features and functions, because they are the ones that create and manage the identities. If you're managing the identities, shouldn't you also manage the security? But they're not. And look, it's hard. It's hard for them to do that because security is not something you can slap on with a Band-Aid after. It has to be foundational. And I think you and I can both agree, just with the name of the podcast, right? Identity at the center. If identity is like part of the steel and concrete foundation of your digital business, say as a house, right? You can't take security and put it on top of the steel. Like it's just like, it has to be that steel within the concrete. So if I were to use that analogy, the identity and access management system would be like the concrete, but it's weak without steel. Security, crypto agile cryptography, which would be your authentication or using FIDO-based methods, the threat aware, all the fraud stuff, all of that is the steel that's in that concrete layer. What I see today, and the reason why we have a lot of these breaches, is because attackers fully well know that the IAM systems are missing that steel. They're getting better, but because it hasn't been put into the foundation itself, we are going to continue to have problems. So it's maybe going to be the fault of the vendors, but if you and I are charged with mitigating risk for the organization, and we see like the platforms, we're either going to put in compensating controls, and that's what companies are doing now. And at some point, I think in the very near future, you're just going to say, well, why don't we just start to like introduce an actual identity security platform that's built with that steel and concrete foundation already versus slapping it on, because we can't slap it on anymore. And like I said, a lot of those platforms, like honestly, they were amazing. They helped create the market. And, but with all that good stuff comes a lot of bad stuff. And I'm going to use the last thing I'll say, Jim, here on this point is Spider-Man, right? With great power comes great responsibility. You are in a position of housing all of my, Jim, you and our identities. You better protect them. Privacy, fraud, scams. I want you to take care of it. And if you can't, I'm like, what? Decentralized identity is not going to solve that. That's just kicking the can down the road to someone else. If we don't solve the transition from IAM to identity security, decentralized identity it's not going to help anybody, because I'm going to be like, well, I got a verifiable claim, but can I actually trust it? Well, it was digitally signed by somebody. I'm like, yeah, well, what if someone manipulated that IAM backend system of that identity provider and generated that verifiable claim? That can happen, right? Anyway, I'll stop there. Clearly, I'm getting very passionate about what I'm doing here.
Yeah, and I'd like to shift the conversation a little bit to the non-human identity side, because we've talked about this Gartner definition, and it's, ensuring the right people have the right access, et cetera, et cetera. And then you even made the statement, well, maybe they've amended it to be the right people on the right, whatever, things or something like that. And I've always said, well, I don't think a thing is an identity, but put that aside. I'm not going to argue that point today. The point I'm going to argue is that I think these machines or non-humans, they've been ignored. And that's why it's like such a bingo moment. It's like, oh, hey, let's talk about non-human identities. Folks, I was talking about non-human identities. I didn't have a catchy term for it, but I was talking about it when I was a Windows system administrator in the 90s. Service accounts were the bane of my existence. But then I started learning about identity management systems, and it was identity management, but today we call it identity administration and governance. And what is really good, and I'm talking about workforce at the moment, right? And I'm thinking about this workforce identity, and I'm thinking, okay, well, here's how it works. There's really just black and white, one right way to do it, which is that you have authoritative sources, systems of record for all the identities, for all the people who work here. Or so it's like the HR system for the people. It might be some kind of contractor system for the contractors. So, but everybody has to be covered. And maybe even do it with your IGA system. Maybe even there's like some kind of workflow that you enable, but there's some way that those are covered. Non-human identities, not the case. I haven't met an organization that's like, well, show me the system of record for, maybe they use ITSM tickets, or maybe they use IGA for some of it. Maybe they use PAM for some of it. I don't think there's a sufficient solution out there that says, you know what, folks, digital identity industry, you've been handling non-human identities wrong. There needs to be a system of record.
Yeah.
Do you agree? There should be a system of record.
I mean, there should be a system of record, but remember, I think there's a lot of parallels that we can draw to the evolution of just IAM and generally, right? But we know about identity security, so we should, as we go on the path of, non-human and machine identity, that's a whole other topic on its own. But, I know Gartner's, because myself and Eric Walsh from Define Machine Identity, and there's a lot of data and customer interviews and all that where we came up with that term. And I'm like, we don't call it, with machine learning, we call it machine learning. And we know what machine learning is, or at least hopefully you know what it is. By this point, you should. We don't call it non-human learning. That doesn't make any sense. And we don't define things based on what they not are. I'm like, look, I've got 2 water bottles here. They're both non-human. My sweater is non-human. At least I hope it's non-human. You know what I mean? Like, science became what it is because we had proper definition. We had the scientific process, right? But we also had definitions. So we can say, yes, there's, dolphins, but there's different kinds of dolphins, right? There's dogs. There's different kinds of breeds of dogs. They're also all non-human, right? So anyway, I don't want to get on that train, but we can certainly.
But I think that's a good point, because I think it's like, okay, you have human identities, and then you have non-human identities. Well, what are the different types of non-human identities?
Yes.
And should they be treated differently? Because if we're going to say they're one group, and maybe that's just where we're at in the evolution, but I think it's like, remember the 20 questions game is animal, vegetable, or mineral, right? And I think there's like 5 types of things. There's like a gas or whatever, but there's different types. So there's application accounts and service accounts. They're different. There's ephemeral accounts. There's OT accounts. Is OT a part of this?
And so there's accounts, and then there's also like machine process, so containers. And I'm going to actually write up a little summary, or at least my take on it. But Satya Nadella's presentation from Ignite, right? That was pretty crazy, because he's talking now about Copilot, but Copilot having like the ability to create all these agents, and and basically you're just saying, like, you're going to have an agent that's going to work with you, work for you. So for example, Anthropic, right, who's another kind of open AI like company, they've made this product called Claude AI, and Claude AI Jim, it's almost like it's scripting, but just insane. It can take over your PC and do certain things, and you can tell it to do that. And so, look, we all see where the trend line is going, and the trend line is going to have like these bots and all these things take over for us. But that is another, to your point, another flavor of machine. Here's the thing, and this is the parallel I was trying to draw. If we go back to the beginnings of IAM, as organizations were starting to, network computers and start to leverage, applications and all these types of things, right? Every application had its own identity store, right? So this is what I was kind of referring to before. Like, if I knew there was a critical application in an organization, I could like go and look and like just rip it apart. Because I learned how to read hexadecimal at a very early age. Again, to mess around with my games, give yourself more health, more money, whatever within games. But you can do the same thing with some of these systems, and every system had its own identity store embedded in it. And the problem with that was like, okay, joiner, mover, leaver. Jim joins the organization. Now we have to go to every app that he might use and create an identity for each one. That was obviously a problem. So then they say, let's make a single source, and that's where HR gets involved. And it's not just like IT; it was a bunch of lines of business that would get involved to have that identity system, manage that identity system. So Jim joins. We go to that one source, put him in an organizational unit, blah, 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 and then he gets access to all that. We don't have that for machines today. So machine identities today, all those flavors that you mentioned, Jim, they're all like what we saw a long time ago at the beginning of IAM. Each, let's call it application, right, has its own ability to create, service accounts or containers or apps or any kind of entity that would be a type of machine. And those can mint those ephemeral identities or all those things. So we need a way, at least today, to get plugs into those so we can push pull into those different types of sources. So you can, number one, you can't measure what you're not managing. So we got to get a hold of those. So right now, what I see a lot of us, the NHI vendors, they've got a lot of discovery capabilities, but less so in my analysis of it. And when I talk to some analysts as well, they're lacking, I think, in some of the governance areas, right? So I think they're getting to that. I think that's a part of the roadmap, but it is an evolution.
I mean, that's a good point, though. And the other thing I want to cut in on is, kind of know your role. Like, what is your role? Is it to essentially manage all non-human accounts for the entire organization? What if you're in a global organization? You could be talking millions of accounts that you don't have a central system of record. You can't manage those. Is it to govern them? Is it to monitor their usage? Define that. If you're a practitioner and you just sign up for something and you don't define what that is, you're setting yourself up for potential failure, because one of those accounts could be used in the breach that takes down a major part of the operations of the organization. Yeah.
No, that's an excellent point. So let me go back to you and I being those other personas. I'll be the CISO, you're the risk officer. We can sit here and ignore them. And a lot of organizations are doing that. And why are they doing that? It's not because they're ignoring them because they're malicious. They're just ignoring them because they haven't been a problem. They haven't been a problem both in they haven't maybe identified them necessarily as a breach source. And auditors aren't really looking for this, at least yet. Right. That's what, honestly, that's what transformed privileged access management, that whole space. I mean, Edward Snowden happened and auditors are looking at all these accounts from a privilege perspective. And that's what gave birth to the PAM market. Machines, I think, we'll start to see that, because there's definitely areas where attackers are going to use and have used these things. But I think the issue, Jim, to what you illustrate is look, if the board came to us and said, look, we have intelligence about potentially some state actors, going after our competitors, because potentially a state actor has access to a quantum computer that can break, some common cryptography. Okay, what do we do with that? It's our job. They're going to look at us and they're going to say, Jim, David, what's our risk here? We throw our hands up in the air and be like, well, we have no idea what systems are using, what systems are vulnerable to those types of attacks, right? And so our job then is to first go out and discover all of the systems that use cryptography and or create machine identities or non-human identities based off of that. And then we can start to say, well, what's the risk? Oh, you know what? Most of the systems that would be at risk, there are all these legacy ones and they're behind all of this other stuff, but we need to tackle it, right? But we could prioritize. Or we could say, oh man, our entire customer facing business where we're generating millions and millions of whatever currency an hour, we'd have to take down our website. We have to rotate the certificates. We'd have to change, so that's what it kind of comes to. With humans, I think, we can say okay, we know we have X number of employees or X number of customers that come in and out to our environment. And there's a little more, it's really easier for us to wrap our heads around. I think the issue with machines and just their flavors, their types, and the amount of them, that's confusing. And what I was trying to say before with Copilot is expect the next wave of machines to come in, even more so. And this is why it's critical. We have to, number one, get this definition right and get behind it. Okay. And so to me, I'm like, the definition of machines, it's already done. I don't know why we're wasting time confusing people, frankly, about NHI, because I now have to define that when I talk to people, and it's just a waste of time when we should be focused on like moving this thing forward versus arguing over definitions. It's a waste. Sorry.
It's true. It's true.
We need to move on. And it's like, we're not going to change. We're not going to call it non-human learning. It's machine learning. So get behind the program. It's already there. Machine ID, do your job in defining what they are, and you'll help people versus wasting time on definitions. Anyway, but I think if we go back to all of it, it is not an easy job to be a risk officer or a CISO now, especially now that you have to really start to think about identity. And that's where, I think the practice needs to move to identity security, and it needs to be inclusive of machines. That needs to be a part of the program. Because again, if you're going to ask you and me, Jim, David, what's our risk here to our organization? We can at least come back and say, here's our risk quantification, machine identities. We have to start leveraging tools, process, and people. Human identities, we're using kind of a productivity centric system. It's good, it's worked, but at the same time, if someone got into our environment, they could do IAM manipulation, and they could get access to a lot of different things. So, we have to pick and choose our battles. But in my view, if we can start to embody identity security with our humans, we can use that maybe simultaneously if you can, but use that as the example to say, like, hey, we showed you how we had to evolve this to identity security for our humans, our partners, our customers, and our employees. We got to do the same for machines, right? So it's a big and bold kind of proposition, but I would start with the humans, obviously, and start to kind of weave that in. The other point too, I'm just going to say here, both for humans and machines. In my travels and a lot of my discussions I've had with hundreds of CISOs over the last few months, cyber resilience. So Jim, I don't know. I want to hear your take on it too, because I know you have tons of conversations. I want to hear your view on it, but I'll just say really, really quick, especially when I came back from Singapore from Identity Week, that was a big topic. There's been some major outages. So here's the thing. Think about a bank again. And banks, big banks, they're like, well, hey, we've got amazing digital services now, right? We got mobile apps, we got web apps. People can like do banking on your phone. Yeah, I can transfer money. I can send money to you. Well, what happens if there's an outage? Because, that never happens. And they have an authentication outage, or their IAM system becomes unusable, or the cloud system they're using just has a major outage. Someone cuts a fiber optic line in the middle of the ocean. That's never happened before. And that won't happen in the future. Come on. Business continuity, disaster recovery. The problem here is that, and I know because I've heard from a CISO recently at a major financial institution, they were just like, yeah, no, our bank is on a tear getting rid of branches. So if we go down, if our digital systems go down, let's just say their authentication system goes down, you got to go into a branch. But now it's like, Jim, the nearest branch to you is 2 hours away. So you're going to have my money, and I have to drive 2 hours one way to get access to my money that I need to pay a bill to keep my energy on or whatever. That's insane. So where we are at now is that a number of these CISOs told me they're expecting regulations to come now with teeth for cyber resilience. And what sparked the conversation was identity security, and not just it's about CIA, right? The triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And in particular, these CISOs were like, David, I want to talk about availability with these identity systems. Some of them have already failed us before on security, and now on the integrity, right? And now we're like, should we really look at availability? And if auditors are going to come in and ask us about this, we got to have better ways of doing this. So anyway, I'll stop there. I really want to hear what you have to say there, Jim, if you've heard anything about cyber resilience, especially as it pertains to
a lot about it. I mean, I think there are a lot of companies starting up to try to address this very big issue. Mm-hmm. What we've seen over the past 5-10 years is a major shift to cloud-based services. And the IAM space is no different. And I say over the last 5 years, almost every organization is leveraging some IAM services in the cloud. I think there's sometimes the assumption that we move it up to the cloud and we don't need to back it up. We don't need to worry about restoring it, and Microsoft's never going to go down. And this isn't a knock on Microsoft. I think they do a great job of all the organizations in the world. They're probably, I don't know if this is true. I was going to say it's the least likely to go down, but it doesn't matter. It's not a 0% chance, right?
No, exactly.
And so
exactly.
Our organizations building that plan B and here's another thing I've thrown. Oh my God, this gets me so excited, this whole topic.
We're nerds,
so
man.
My mind's going in all different directions.
Yeah.
But I feel like C-levels in cyber, C-levels in information security, and CIOs all came up in the 90s, the 2000s. They came up when applications needed to be backed up. And you'd hold periodic tabletop exercises where you restore. Maybe you go to SunGuard, right? And you have like a whole bunch of hardware there, and you have to restore your entire environment, and you know what order you're going to do it in. Well, I think the assumption that a lot of folks make, and I think is a big mistake, is that we don't have to worry about the cloud SaaS applications, right? It goes down, we get our apps running at SunGuard, and then we just point them out to our IDP or whatever. I just think that's a thing that would keep me up at night.
It's look, when you think about the practice of risk management, right, and risk quantification and risk calculation, massive, right? We're not going to go into GRC here or anything like that, but there's some interesting innovation in GRC. The compute landscape, right? These Gen AI co-pilots or bots that we're going to be having. So there's going to be good bots and bad bots. We're going to start to see that hit us like a tidal wave. So good machines, bad machines. There's also the notion of all of our data and everything else, right? Like, what do we have? We need the data to fuel these Gen AI engines and fuel these chat bots and all these things that we want to do. Automation and all this stuff needs actual good data. The landscape, in my view, Jim, the digital landscape, digital identity, cyber threats, the Gen AI technology, all these things that are coming in, is changing faster than our ability to model the risk. Period, full stop. So, and we don't have a choice, right? We don't have a choice. We can't throw our hands in the air and say, well, I guess we're just not going to do any of this. Hey, machine identity is too complicated. Let's just not do it. There's too many systems. Let's not do it. No. Look, I think there's some really interesting innovators out there. I think there's a big open field for innovation. Absolutely. But there's also, the organizations themselves have to deal with this. And so when we come back to cyber resilience, I think, Satya Nadella talked about kind of like, I can't remember the name, so don't get mad at me here, but he talked about like some kind of on-prem flavors of Azure. And I was like, I know where that's coming from. There's some customers that are just like, hey, look, you're right. It's not a zero risk that like Azure would go down. It could go down, or me go down in my region, or even my region might lose access to this service that has like. Can
I interrupt you for 1 second?
Yeah, of course.
Because I think it's not even that the availability zone or however you want to call it goes down. That's the old disaster. The new disaster is your admin plugs into the network. He gets locked out from his computer, doesn't know what's going on, but it takes his credentials, logs into your, this is all behind the scenes and no one even knows it's happening, logs into your critical IAM systems and starts just changing all your configurations to gibberish. And all of a sudden, your IAM systems don't work anymore.
Yeah.
Isn't that wonderful? Or it goes into your database and deletes all your data. But that's the new disaster. And then what choice do you have but to pay the ransom or hopefully be able to restore? So hopefully you're in a position where you can restore even if you decide to pay the ransom.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I want to link this back to identity security, right? Because I think we've covered a lot of ground. Because machines fall under that, humans, partners, customers, all of that. And whether you aim to look at one, I don't think there's going to be one, big platform, at least today, that's going to be able to do all that. That's a lot. That's a lot to do. And those are different things. But resilience, I think, is a concept and term that needs to be weaved in. So it's actually like resilient identity security, because I think if you think about a superhero, like, let's just go with Superman or Superwoman, right? Or Wonder Woman, right? They're like, you think about their superpowers, right? They're not just strong and, they not only run fast and do all those things, but they're also resilient. They can take a lot of hits. And this game of identity security, unlike IAM, it's more of like a boxing match. And I don't know any boxing match or any kind of fight where the individual that won the fight didn't get punched. Of course they're going to get punched. So
you didn't see the Mike Tyson fight, did you?
I couldn't watch it. I tried, but I was like, I can't.
Sorry,
sometimes
off track. Go ahead.
No. But sometimes you just want to see like people like that. It's like, hey, I have memories and I don't want them to just like leave it as is, right? Before, like, some people say, come on, man, it's just like throw in the towel, like don't throw in the towel, but know your role. Like, you're at the point where you should be a mentor and advisor, and like, you're not in the field anymore, anyway.
That's right.
But what I was trying to say there, Jim, is that resilience is something that is a characteristic that has to be deeply a part, again, of that concrete and steel foundation. So it has to be resilient. So it can take your house, using that analogy again. The house can take an earthquake. It's got that concrete and steel foundation of identity security. And there's an outage with one authentication system in one cloud environment. Well, if it's deployed in an active hot swap type scenario, okay, that's gone down for whatever reason. Now it flips over to the other. The other thing too, and this was the big thing that I've kind of come to realize, and look, I'll like full disclosure too, with the organization I work with, Transmit Security today, Transmit's, a part of these conversations I've been having with folks on identity resilience is also about like, what keeps you up at night? And they're like, well, given some of the high profile IAM breaches and outages that happened or last year and the year before, we recognize that IAM is critical infrastructure. That's kind of what I was alluding to with, these banks taking out branches and stuff. If those identity systems go down, or any part of that supply chain of your identity system goes down, now if you're using it for both workforce and customer, and then it goes down, as we would say in Canada, because I'm Canadian, you're host, because now maybe your employees can access everything. But the CrowdStrike outage, all these things kind of came, and these CISOs are like, hey, and risk officers, we need a way to like almost wrap our identity systems in something, and if it goes down, to flip over to something else, right? And so I brought that to kind of our team at Transmit and just say, hey, look, as someone who's basically like a field CISO, effectively, or that's one hat I wear, in interviewing these folks, they're like, that's one thing that they would see. Maybe they won't get rid of like one of their, if it's Ping, if it's Okta or whatever, or Microsoft, they're like, we don't want to like necessarily rip them out, but they need something to wrap around them so that if something happens and, it's not their fault or whatever, but the risk isn't zero. No one's perfect. Things happen. Tidal wave could happen that could literally take out a critical data center, and maybe that was something we were relying on. We got to flip over to something else. And we can't necessarily, as I think you really, really well put it out, and I've been guilty of this too, the shared responsibility model, right? So I go, well, hey, Microsoft or the CSP or whomever is they're going to take care of network security. They're going to take a physical security and all this, and I don't have to worry about all that. Okay, no, that's fine. Like, that's why you're relying on the cloud. But I think what's happening now, Jim, is that we've been using cloud environments long enough, and we're still learning. And one of I think the major learnings now is like, you got to have a backup of the backup, and you have to have a plan, to override something, that a failure that might happen. And again, I'm not picking on Microsoft. They've done an amazing job. It's just that they're quite prominent. But this applies to Google and Amazon and any other CSP that's out there. They could talk until they're blue in the face about the things that they have, and that's great. But I think what these CISOs are saying is like, they want a little more control over their own destiny And those IAM failures that happened in the past, they're like, some of them DCs might either move away from them over time, or they might say, we're going to keep them in, but do we just like put more compensating controls around them? And so that's what we're hearing with resilience.
If identity security breaks down, is what we've been talking about, and somebody goes in, they look like a legit user, and they wipe out all of your configurations, whose fault is that?
Ooh, yeah.
Is that your service provider's fault? No.
Yeah. Yep.
You logged in with the credentials that you set up the security settings for. The person knew the secret, maybe was able to respond to the multi-factor authentication, and then changed all your settings. I mean, can you restore old settings? I don't know. You better understand. I mean, if you're going to go and spend $1 million or more on a software as a service for your security, and it's a major component, something you need to have working to keep your business operational, you better know what you're going to do in that scenario. To me, that's the modern day disaster. It's either a ransomware event or it's some type of event where somebody's looking to do damage. It's not the earthquake, it's not the tidal wave. Those things can be easily, I say easily, but you look at like, your modern platform as a service, and availability zones that should take care of the earthquake scenario. You use a West Coast and East Coast, or somewhere in between, or a couple different parts of the world, and all those things can be mitigated pretty easily, or mitigated with money.
Yeah. And I think there's no perfect solution, but you're right. I think you can at least say there's something you can do about it. But I think there's a distinction of this scenario you're saying is like, there's resilience as in terms of the ability to, and this comes back to true identity security and what you said earlier on in the podcast about, is this Jim? Is this his behavior? Is he, all of these things. And if something looks weird, you can do something. You either stop the access or say what's going on. Actually, I'll tell a very quick story. I mentioned the research, one of the last research notes I wrote at Gartner was about ransomware and how it's not a malware problem. It's a data and identity access problem. And the data source behind that was, it was several interviews, but there was like 30 clients, practitioners I interviewed, and all of them, and I mean, we're talking like over like, it's like 30 out of a lot of people, but these were 30 people that successfully stopped ransomware. They did it because they were using data access governance tools, but how those tools, some of them monitored user behavior. And in the case, what happened over and over again was actually Varonis. So I'll do a shout out to Varonis. I don't have any, stake in the game here with Varonis. I'm just saying like they were a tool that I encountered. And so they had two ways, right? So one, they would do like right size access. So Varonis had the ability to, have hooks in the kernel to look at file access, read and write. And what they would do is like, okay, first of all, I can say, okay, Jim is this particular user, not just from an identity governance standpoint, from a data lens. I can like, even though he might have access to the SharePoint site, which has 100 files in there, I could say his identity allows him to get into SharePoint based on its, on the role, the group you're in. But maybe Jim shouldn't have access to the, let's just say 1,000 files that are in that site. Maybe he only needs access to 100. And we can exercise just in time type principles and have that programmatic framework. So he could ask maybe David's permissions, let's just say I own that, to get access to certain files in there. But we know on a day-to-day basis, he probably only needs access to the 100. Okay, so that was what I framed in the research note as like a static approach. And that's a good one. It's called right size access. That's number one. But the killer feature where they caught the ransomware over and over again. And these were clients that were big customers, Jim. Like they've had the best of breed tools, envious of, lots of others with their budgets and their teams and like having like several thousand IT people and like security people, like all kinds. We red team, we tabletop. Ransomware still got in. None of the other tools caught it. How they caught it was the second piece. they started seeing, wait a minute, Jim normally, because we baselined him, Jim normally only accesses, let's just use that SharePoint site. He only accesses maybe like 5 files an hour, right? But for some reason, he was accessing 10,000 files in less than 5 minutes. Okay. Now that could be a good bot, but that's another topic, right? But at least for what they saw, that was highly suspect. So what they did was they paused the process and then they investigated and it was ransomware. So this is what happened. Not all the 30, but some of them. The ones that did the right size access, number one, the ransomware went onto Jim's machine and it leveraged Jim's rights and entitlements. So everything Jim has access to, his machine identities related to him, and all the accounts and human identities you have related to you. That's what the ransomware used, and it encrypted everything it had access to. Now, because some of them did right size access, say in that SharePoint site, it only encrypted part of the 100 files. But then the second piece of the behavior kicked in and it said, let's stop this because it's weird. It encrypted a lot of things, but it didn't get to the keys of the kingdom. And they were able to see like, it encrypted a whole range of things and then it stopped. So the epiphany there was like, if you do right size access, that shrinks your attack surface, 1. 2, if you're looking at behavior, you can now see, like going back again to the concern you have, Jim, with resilience and outages, is like, wait a minute, why is he suddenly going into the IAM system and changing things? Or why is he deleting things? Or why are they doing so? Let's just stop this. And maybe there's a business reason for it, legitimate, but we're going to stop this and get in the way of productivity for a moment because the risk profile justifies us stopping it. Businesses just don't do that today, unfortunately. I think they're getting there. Part of the issue is education, knowledge. The other part is, again, great power comes great responsibility. I think some of the cybersecurity stacks have massive holes here. And I think the IAM providers, right, coming back to them. And again, yes, I'm picking on you. I don't care. Like, we can talk about it. I think we need to have this discussion as an industry that IAM is productivity based. It's not security. And I know we're trying to make these efforts, but I think for some of the providers that are out there, the journey to identity security is going to not be as difficult, but for others, it might be. I'm not going to name names. I'm not going to get into that. That's irrelevant. I'm trying to just say, like, the market needs to start to think about evolving this way. Anyway, I'll stop there. I know there's so many things we touched on.
No, I really appreciate it. And I hope that the listeners kind of appreciate we went a little bit longer than normal, and we'll call it there. But this is a great conversation. It wouldn't be the Identity at the Center if we didn't have a little bit of a lighter note. And I think you're the perfect guest for a question I've been hanging on to for a long time. And here it goes, David. You have to design the perfect trail mix, but you can only select 4 ingredients. I'm asking you, what are the 4 ingredients, and what is one ingredient that does not make it into your trail mix, no matter how many ingredients you can choose?
Oh, this is a good question. It does remind, if you watch Curb Your Enthusiasm, it reminds me of one episode where he had David Schwimmer on. And David Schwimmer, from Friends, his dad had a trail mix company. And Larry David was looking at the packages and he was like, I don't like the ratio of raisins to cashew. I think he had way more raisins. I think it was like 3 cashews.
Oh, that's totally Larry David. It's a Larry David type question.
He's like, hey, I've noticed that you're a little bit stingy on the cashew allotment. Anyway, that's a great question. And just for the audience, so they know, total surprise. Okay, I did not know that this question was coming at me. Look, I'm a health nut. Anyway, I would say cashews, walnuts, because those are both very good for you. I would put in maybe some pumpkin seeds, because they're very good for digestion and omegas and whatnot. And then, you need to have something sweet in there, get some sugars or whatever. I would say raisins, just because I really like raisins. Ideally, I would probably... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
You are a health nut, man. No chocolate, huh?
Well, and I'll get to that in a second. That was the thing you said not to include. And I'll give you a bonus one there too. But I was going to say, instead of raisins, I ideally would have dates, but the issue with dates is they're not that small. So trail mix, raisins, cashews, pumpkin seeds, and walnuts. Walnuts are really good for you. Okay. What I wouldn't include, you hit it, chocolate, not because I don't like it. I love chocolate. I just figured like, I'm a health nut. So I'm trying to stay more on the healthy side and not as many sugars. And if you're going to have some sugar, at least with the raisins, you're getting some fiber and there's some other benefits as well, with the raisins and especially with dates, if you can manage that. And I think the bonus would be like cranberries, like the dried cranberries. Again, I like them. You're going to get some of the fiber benefits, but I think
they're sugar bombs.
Exactly. They're just sugar bombs. So sugar is the culprit that I'd probably try and eliminate, but in trail mix, you want to have some sugar in there to give you a little bit of an energy bump. So anyway, hopefully that was a good answer. I don't know.
It is a good answer. And it's like such a personal thing. For me, there's no pistachios in my trail mix.
No.
That is like the one ingredient I think would ruin the flavor of the entire trail mix. Like, I hate pistachios. And I know that's going to be very unpopular.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I love them, but I'm not going to get in. And I respect your, I respect how you can, not like it, but that's okay. We don't need to get in an argument.
I'm not really a dried fruit person either. Like dried apricots, I don't like them. Dried bananas, don't like them.
Dried mangoes?
So if I was to what's that?
Dried mangoes.
Dried mangoes. I'm not sure.
Oh, they're good.
I don't think I would like them.
Okay. Is it the texture or is it the taste?
It's the texture. I mean, I like fruit.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the texture. So for me, I'm kind of like you. I want to have a health aspect, but then there's part of me that doesn't care. And so, because like, assumably while you're eating the trail mix, you're not just sitting and watching TV, right? You're up and moving and you're going to burn some calories. So you want to have the fat because that's going to give you your long-term energy, but you also, I think you want it to taste good and you want the sugar. So I picked 2 nuts, chocolate, which is going to be M&Ms. I think it's the only type that be pretty sure is not going to melt. I picked dried cranberries over raisins. Part of the advantage here, David, is I've had time to think about this. So thinking one of those...
Unfair. No, go ahead.
One of the nuts has got to be almonds, I think. And I know I say that weird for some people, almonds. But that would be one of the nuts. And then the other might be good old peanuts. But I've also thought a wild card instead of nuts could be like, those sesame sticks that are in a lot of like...
Yes. Yeah.
Like Chex Mix kind of thing. So that could give you a little more extra crunch. I think some crunch would be nice. So I'm going to go with that. Sesame sticks, almonds, M&Ms, and cranberries. But as Larry David would say, it's got to be in the right ratio.
You got to have the right ratio. You got to too much of any one of those will throw it off, and too little of any one of those will throw it off. So you got to have the right balance. And look, I'm not a trail mix expert, but yeah, I agree with you because I think it sounds like for you, I was going to say like fruit, like the actual, like if you, an actual mango, an actual like apricot, that might be the better way, especially you don't like the texture. But yeah, the advantage with the dried fruits and all these dried goods is that, for you and I who travel, like that's something you can throw in your bag. And if you're on the plane and there's too much turbulence and they're not serving anything, as has happened before, sat for several hours flying with no food, no water, no nothing. But luckily I had my trusty water bottle. And I think I had a little bag of cashews. It didn't have raisins, but like I at least had like a little thing of cashews in my bag that I could at least snack on. Like that kind of stuff. So that's the nice thing with it. And then there's nothing to like really throw out other than the bag that it's in, So, but hey, no, that was a good question. So, it's good.
I thought you'd be perfect for that. So, David, thank you so much for coming on the show. I will see you in a couple of weeks now. We got the Gartner IAM Summit. Remember, if you haven't registered yet, we have a discount code IDAC375. Definitely encourage folks to use it. It'll be in the show notes, along with the link to get to the registration page. You can find David on LinkedIn. He's always open to connect. He works for Transmit Security, which I think you have transmitsecurity.com. We at the IDAC podcast have idacpodcast.com. You can always find us there or on LinkedIn. Jeff and I are on LinkedIn. We also have an Identity at the Center page, which we would love it if you'd go out and follow. If you listen to the podcast on audio only format like Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please go out and give us a 5-star rating, leave a review. It's always very much appreciated. That helps other folks find the show. We're also on YouTube. So all you have to do is go idacpodcast.tv. Brings you right to our YouTube page. We'd love it if you would subscribe. This video and others will be there that you can actually start to match faces with names and voices. I know since we've started doing it, a lot more people recognize me at conferences and come up and say hi. If you are at Gartner IAM Summit, please look for me, look for Jeff, look for David. We always love to know the people that are listening to the podcast. And we really appreciate you devoting your time to listening to this podcast. We put all this effort in for you guys, the IAM practitioners of the world, and we appreciate you more than you realize. So thank you, and we'll talk to everyone on the next episode.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com. See you next time on Identity at the Center.